You're listening to the Talking Air Filtration podcast, where you get to know the people that make air filtration possible and help us all breathe easier. Because clean air matters.
We'll get insights from air filtration professionals and learn how they became successful in their careers. Along the way, we will discuss best practices, guidelines, trends, and challenges in air filtration in a variety of applications. We hope HVAC, air filtration, and indoor air quality pros, including business development, engineering, building owners, and facilities management, will enjoy the insights our guests will bring to this podcast.
Our next presentation is titled Position Yourself to Sell Filtration in the Healthcare Market. Jacob Scheider is the Program Manager at Meadows Ohly, a real estate services firm specialising in healthcare. Healthcare is one of the biggest markets for filtration, but getting the right people to pay enough attention to it is always a challenge. In this presentation, you'll learn from Jacob how the end users, project managers, and property managers are or are not thinking about filters. So can you give a big warm welcome to Jacob to the stage? Thank you.
Hey, morning, everybody. It was a great seminar just now. I'm feeling a little bit electric coming off of that. So hopefully I can carry some of that energy through here in my presentation, but it's going to be a little bit more educational. So, keep your expectations tempered. So I am Jacob Scheider. Thank you for the great introduction. A little bit about me before I get started. I am a civil engineer by education, but have spent my career managing large hospital construction projects, large capital programs for all different healthcare organizations up and down the East Coast. In my time, I have managed the implementation of about $2 billion worth of facilities, over 2 million square feet, with probably 7 or 8 different major clients. So what I'm hoping to bring today to the table is to talk through kind of how does that process work? When we go through the process of designing, building a healthcare facility, operating it, what are we thinking about? Who is in the kind of decision maker's seat at what point, so that hopefully you all can take away kind of how do you insert yourself into that process with the right people kind of at the right time. The 3 ways that I want to talk through that today, I kind of want to give you guys an overview of project lifecycle. How does a project go from start to finish? I want to talk about the team structure, kind of at each phase of that project, who's involved and kind of what position are they in that phase of the project. And then how are decisions made? What does the process look like? What do we think about? What do we consider? What do we not consider at different phases of the project? So I'll start by talking through just kind of a typical overall team structure on a project. And if you look at most org charts for kind of these large hospital projects, this is typically what they'll tend to look like. Kind of at the center of this kind of sideways hourglass here, you've got what I'll call the owner's core team. It's people like facilities engineers, hospital administration, kind of all the project management teams. Kind of off to the side is kind of all the kind of healthcare focused people, clinical staff, kind of more administrators, actual facilities engineers, and other miscellaneous end users. And kind of on the other side of all that is kind of everyone on the kind of construction and implementation side. You've got your construction managers, architects, kind of a layer removed from that. You've got your MEP trade partners, you've got your specialty designers and engineers, and kind of a layer removed from that still, equipment manufacturers and material suppliers. So kind of at its core, this is how teams are structured in large projects like this. But we'll talk through kind of during each phase how this diagram shifts and kind of changes. So life cycle for a large project, I break down into 5 different phases, and I'll spend some time kind of breaking down what happens in each phase a little bit further on. But it all starts at project launch, kind of setting ourselves up to figure out what the project is and how we're going to go about it. We design the facility, we contract everybody, we move into the construction phase where we actually build, and then kind of activation and ongoing operations, which is basically for the entire life of the facility, 50 years or more, we're kind of in that operations phase. So kind of breaking down how our decisions made during each of these phases. I have up here kind of who is in the driver's seat at each phase of the project and kind of what are they thinking about? What are the drivers for how they make 1.5 million decisions on these projects? And I'll go into kind of each of these phases a little bit more. But before I do, I want to speak for a minute about this graph. This is called the McClamey curve. The concept that it intends to describe is really intuitive, but one that I think is really, really important to keep in the back of our minds as we think about decisions throughout the lifetime of a facility. What this is basically telling us is that the earlier we make decisions, the more impactful they can be, the less cost they have, and just it's an easier to go about making changes, making decisions earlier on in the project, earlier on in the life cycle of a facility. The later it gets, the more barriers there are, the more cost there is, the more just hoops there are to jump through to really get anything done. So really the core concept here is that, making sure that early on things are set up appropriately and that we're making and influencing decisions in the right way early on really goes the longest way. So first stage of these projects is project launch, as I call it. So kind of during this phase of the project, we're meeting usually with kind of core administrators. It's typically kind of off in a closed door kind of room, talking through what the overall goals are for what the project is going to be, what the facility is going to look like, what are the needs that this facility has. At times, we will onboard some of our major partners, architects, engineers, to kind of help us talk through that process as kind of subject matter experts for us. And then developing the project budget is a really, really key step at this phase. We like to use what we call target value design during these projects, which is kind of starting at the very beginning, establishing what our budget is for these projects and kind of molding the scope to fit that. Why that's important is that as we move through what could end up being an 8 or 10 year cycle just to get this building open, is that budget tends to remain the same. So all of our decisions are kind of influenced by how do we set up what we can spend and how it's broken down, kind of where we can spend those dollars. So team structure at this phase of the project looks a lot different than the initial slide that I showed with that sideways hourglass, and really has the owner's core team, as I call it, in the middle. And that's made up of a hospital administrator, a planning, design, and construction department that you'll typically see at these large healthcare organizations. And internal finance is really important here too. Kind of how are we funding the project? What requirements come with that? And then also kind of developing that overall budget. Some of the drivers that we see for decisions at this phase of the project are organizational needs are really important. Do we have aging facilities that need to be replaced? Are there changing patient volumes that we need to, adjust and try to meet? We look at life cycle cost analysis for these buildings. What operationally are we going to need to spend throughout the life cycle of this facility and maintenance and things like that? We think about financing obligations that we have. A lot of these projects tend to be in the hundreds of millions, if not $1 billion range. And that needs to be financed in some kind of way. And those can come with all sorts of really kind of crazy obligations that we have to those financing organizations, which could be as simple as something that we need to report, or there could be some kind of government grant that's involved that comes with, X, Y, and Z loopholes. So it's important to keep whatever those project-specific requirements are. And then just kind of organizational goals that we may have. Is this an organization that's focused on sustainability, LEED, or WELL? Is this a facility that's very focused on patient care and kind of what programs we put in place? And then employee recruitment and retention is obviously a very important thing right now. So how does that play into how we develop these projects? So I want to talk a little bit more about just kind of what some project goals ultimately manifest themselves as. And here's an example from a project that I was a part of goals that we defined for ourselves at the onset of the project. What you guys will notice about this is that for a hospital, very mission driven. These organizations are extremely, extremely focused on patient care, maximizing success for patients. And that really shows itself in these 6 goals that are kind of here. It's a lot about, research and being at the innovative forefront of research. It's about patient satisfaction, and kind of as our 6th slide here, our 6th goal here, sustainability comes into play, but certainly not kind of first and foremost in everyone's minds as we move through the process here.
Are your air filtration personnel NAFA certified? Ask if they belong to NAFA and have their certified air filter specialist or NAFA certified technician designations. The CAFS and NCT designations are earned after rigorous exams and demonstrate that the air filtration professional has a high degree of knowledge and professionalism. To learn more about NAFA certifications, visit nafahq.org.
So kind of second phase of the project is the design phase. A lot of decisions get made during this phase. We start with a blank piece of paper and end the project or end the phase with an actual design building that we can go out and construct. So we go about kind of developing this design by establishing what we call project implementation teams, PIT teams. And I'll talk a little bit more in a minute about what those look like. But as far as in this whole life cycle, these PIT groups really tend to be the most influential of any group or person throughout an entire facility's life cycle in kind of how things get implemented, what goes into the project and what doesn't. As I mentioned at the end, we end up with design documents, and I'll jump back for a second and talk about spec development as well. How do we go about determining what the specifications for the project are going to be? Once those get kind of put into place, it's an uphill battle for the entire next 50, 75 years of this building to undo that, to change things, to replace things. So how do we get involved early to make sure that certain items are included in the spec versus others? Facility standards come into play if an organization is sophisticated enough to have them. And I'll speak in a minute a little bit more about kind of how those get developed and what those typically include and who they look to help develop those kinds of standards books. So team structure at this phase of the project is really all about these PIT teams. So we break those down by design or construction discipline, right? Things like structural, mechanical, equipment, low voltage, electric, all the above. And each of those is really responsible for the core design of that piece of the facility. They work in conjunction with one another. They coordinate with one another through this core team on the project. But these teams are really given a lot of autonomy at this phase of the project to make decisions. Typically, there's some sort of dollar threshold that's set up, which could be as high, as low as $100,000 or as high as $1 million that they can kind of make decisions on autonomously. So the kinds of people that are involved in making those decisions, typically there is your engineer, there's an architect, there's some sort of end user, a facilities lead, or otherwise, depending on kind of what PIT team we're talking about. They stay together through the life of the project, these PIT teams, but it's really during the design phase of these projects that the autonomy really comes into play. So being able to speak to these people that are working within these groups, and it's not always the lead engineer necessarily, but a more specialty engineer within the firm that's working on these things, really will go the longest way as far as implementing things in a project. So what drives decisions at this phase of the project? Meeting code requirements is obviously number one, and that's a theme that you'll see kind of throughout the rest of the phases of this project that wasn't necessarily in the project launch phase. Healthcare organizations are extremely focused on making sure they meet code minimums. Inspections happen extremely regularly. Plan reviews have an extreme amount of oversight. So making sure that every decision that we make is in adherence to all the different codes that we are obligated to. Things like FGI, which are guidelines, not codes, state construction codes, ASHRAE, NFPA, all that kind of stuff, always at front of mind. We think a lot about lifecycle cost analysis at this phase of the project. How are the decisions that we make going to impact users operationally once they get into the space? We think about facility standards books. I'll talk a little bit more about those in a minute, but making sure that if the facility has any kind of preferences, standards, guidelines that we need to adhere to, that we are following those to the best of our ability. And then also just existing spec utilization. A lot of engineering firms a lot of architecture firms come with kind of a pre-built spec book that I'm sure many of you guys are familiar with seeing, how did this boilerplate spec get in here? This doesn't apply at all to what we're talking about. But they come pre-prepared with those. So, obviously being able to influence those before they even make it into the project in the first place will go a long way. So these facilities standards books come from a few different places. People like a facilities engineering team have a vested interest in having standards throughout their facilities, making sure that they're, dealing with the same brand of filter and not 400 within their facility. People like an infection prevention group has a vested interest in making sure that standards are upheld throughout the facility. Their goals are obviously minimizing infection that are transmitted within the hospital, as well as just maintaining staff and visitor wellness within the facility, keeping things clean. So they have a really, really vested interest in making sure that what everyone is supposed to do and how they're supposed to do it is extremely clear. They also, both of these groups tend to reach out to third-party engineering or design groups to kind of help assist with development of those specifications, just bringing subject matter experts into the fold. So what's included in these standards books is highly, highly variable, and really is generated from whoever at that organization has, pain points in their past that they want to make sure aren't repeated in the future. I wouldn't say that, every facility will spec a certain kind of, plumbing fixture as their standard. We only use this brand of sink, but it really, like I said, depends on the organization, kind of what it is they're focused on. And it could be everything from filter specifications to sink brands to lights and boom brands that we use to the type of flooring that's used and really, really everything in between. So a couple other things that kind of drive inclusion in a standards book are these group purchasing organizations, which a lot of healthcare facilities are a part of, and they can cover everything from ceiling tiles to flooring materials to filters to thermometers and, surgical lights and everything in between. So not always with the consultation of end users, but kind of at a higher level, these administrative groups will sign up for these group purchasing organizations, and facilities are kind of then beholden to use these products because of the cost advantage that it brings them. And then also I mentioned just facility experience and recommendations they get from their engineering partners. So moving into the next phase of the project, I call contracting. So at this phase of the project is where we really start to onboard all of our major partners if they haven't been already, and kind of trade partners, sub-consultants, all that kind of stuff. But the really important part of this process or this phase is this budget alignment process that I'll get into in a little bit more detail later. But at a high level, basically, we've established this target value, what the budget for the project is going to be before we even started the design of the facility. We've gone through the design. Scope creep has kind of hit us pretty hard. We've added this, that, escalation hits. And now the project that we thought we can afford, we can't afford. Very, very typical situation for these large projects. So at this phase of the project, there's a very, very intensive budget alignment process where we look at every opportunity to reduce cost without reducing scope to kind of get ourselves back in line. So I'll talk about that more in a minute. But kind of team structure during this phase of the project, again, is different than what we've been seeing previously. We have set a target budget. We have a design in hand. Now we kind of task our construction managers and all of our trade partners to figure out how to get it done for the price that we have set. So they are challenged pretty heavily to make decisions that are not going to be majorly impactful, that are going to get us on budget where we need to be. So the construction manager at this point in the project takes a really, really heavy role in the decision-making process to kind of finesse and massage the scope to make sure that it meets the design intent, but also comes within budget. So some of the decision drivers at this phase of the project, again, code requirements, always front of mind, making sure that we're not going to do anything that's in violation of code, no matter how much money we may save. First cost is really, really important at this phase of the project. We've been talking about lifecycle cost previously, but at this point, we have a group that's tasked to deliver something basically right now for a certain price. So thinking about how those financial decisions impact us today become much more important. Schedule impacts also are very important. Typically at this phase of the project, an opening date's been set, and we only have so much time to work through any issues that we have and still make schedules. So that's obviously very important. And then making sure that none of the decisions that we make at this point in the project invalidate the design intent that our architects and engineers kind of put forward. So speaking a little bit more about this budget alignment process, we get extremely detailed at this phase, talking through what all of our options are. The example that I have on the screen here is a snippet, very small snippet from a log that I've used to kind of track what all those options are. We talk through what the impacts are going to be, cost and schedule. We solicit feedback as needed from end users to make sure that we're not in violation of any kind of standards or preferences that they have. But really kind of the core theme of what happens here is that everybody's looking for help. Everybody's looking for suggestions and ideas about how to get ourselves back in line. The construction manager is tasked with making this happen, but they're kind of a jack of all trades when it comes to the specifics of what goes on in these facilities and how decisions impact cost. So they're looking to their trade partners, they're looking to people in the market for what are things that we can do to bring costs down on this project. And some of them can be pretty major changes at this phase. There was an example that I looked at where we had a facility that was designed with chilled beams entirely throughout, and we made a switch to the tune of almost $2 million to go to a fully vented system within the building. So even though something that feels kind of so core to the design of the HVAC system within the facility, that's all up on the table to get ourselves back in budget. So if I had to kind of pinpoint one point within a project where influence can be made the most, where people are really looking and searching for ideas and suggestions, this time right here is the phase. So we have successfully got ourselves back on budget. Great. We move into the construction phase of the project where we actually go out and build the thing. We procure materials, go through kind of typical construction administration processes. We onboard a commissioning agent who has an ability to kind of influence a lot of ongoing decisions regarding MEP throughout the project. And change management really becomes kind of the focus at this phase. We have a plan, we're going to execute the plan. The biggest risk at this moment is change to the scope, change to really anything, because it throws off our ability to get things done per the schedule. So I'll talk in a little bit about kind of how we manage change throughout this process, throughout this phase, and kind of how that inhibits the ability to kind of influence at this stage. So team structure at this phase of the project, again, changes. Core team kind of goes back to the top, and that's that kind of owners, facilities, project management group, as well as a lead from the architect and contractor. Kind of below them, the rest of the design team and the construction team kind of work. And then kind of really below there, we've got end users and other kind of sub-trade partners at that point. At this phase of the project, as you get to the bottom of the pyramid, the ability to influence decision and change on the project becomes less and less and less, and more happens within that kind of smaller core team. So things that drive decisions at this phase of the project, again, code requirements always. First cost analysis, similar to the contracting phase of the process, is extremely important. We're focused on not exceeding the budget. There are a million issues and problems that come up during the construction phase of the project that we can rarely afford to make decisions that don't impact the bottom line in a positive way. Schedule impacts are still important. As we move through the project, making sure that we stay on schedule is extremely important for these healthcare organizations as they project out opening dates, and there's so much that goes on in the background with them that not hitting an opening date is extremely impactful. They've got if you're opening a new facility, you may be onboarding 600 new clinicians to the facility. They're all projected to start at a certain date. So the staff costs of being late on that are add up extremely quickly, as well as missed revenue from not being able to perform surgeries and see patients. It's extremely impactful. And then always making sure that we meet the design intent. There's a lot of back and forth that goes on when it comes to submittals and substitution requests and RFI responses, that always keeping a focus on kind of what our guiding principles were at the start is very important. So we reference those a lot at this phase of the project, and it ends up swinging decisions regarding some things at this phase. So double back to the change management process. I have a flow chart here that I use on my projects for how we go about making and studying decisions at this point in time. And there's a lot of steps on there, as you guys can see. And that's kind of the message behind this phase of the project, is to get anything done, to change anything from what the base scope is going to be. There is an extremely cumbersome process to go through, which is important to help us as a project management team protect the budget for the project, to make sure that by making a decision doing one thing, we're not impacting someone else's operations in another way. We really take the time to study these things, and I would say that most changes that are requested do not ultimately make it through to the end of the process and are approved unless they have some kind of critical life safety type driver behind them. So kind of the last phase of the project here is what I call activation and operation. So the facility has been constructed. We're starting up equipment for the first time, burning things in. We are educating and training all of our staff members. We're going through final inspections that can come with a handful of different comments depending on what organization or AHJ, authority having jurisdiction, is inspecting at the time. And then maintenance of the facility really kicks in at this point. We need to set up preventative maintenance programs for everything in the facility. There's a big focus on kind of being foolproof in the way that those happen. Right now, there's a trend in healthcare and really a lot of real estate that experienced building managers, facilities engineers are kind of disappearing. We heard it before in the last seminar that, for a long time, people were encouraged to move into trades. That's changing now, but it takes time for people to get involved in those careers and become a knowledgeable plumber for a facility, become a knowledgeable electrician. So making sure we set up these programs that, anyone can manage, they manage themselves, are really important. Top of, managing attic stock for filters, for lights, for really everything in the facility. These facilities have an extremely limited amount of non-clinical space in them. So setting up some kind of program that doesn't fill up their entire mechanical space with, backup filtration is really important to these facility managers as well. And then in general, just establishing service contracts for everything that we have in the building. We install a certain air handler, we install a certain generator. That's going to come with a certain service contract, and it really becomes an extremely uphill battle to make a change on that once they're put in place. So team structure at this phase of not so much the project anymore, but really just in the facility. You have the group that kind of works within the hospital in the bottom right there, overseen by hospital administration. You've got kind of all these subgroups like your infection prevention, like your facilities department, and 100 other departments within the facility. They tend to be granted a lot of autonomy to manage their scope within the facility. So facilities managers will, be given a pretty hefty budget to take care of things that they're mostly allowed to operate in without kind of having to go through the motions with 100 different departments or some kind of major process. They become pretty free at this point to make decisions. Kind of off to the side is the planning, design, and construction department. While they were joined at the hip with the facilities group during the construction of this project, or any project, that becomes separated once the facility is open, and kind of the facilities group will take back over. The kind of things that would trigger them getting involved in any kind of project sometimes have to do with cost, although that can come in the millions and millions of dollars range before that kind of group gets involved. But typically it's whether or not a permit is going to be required for whatever change needs to be made. So these facility managers have an extreme amount of freedom to make all of these changes, decisions, until they get to the point where that needs to be a permitted construction project. All these groups are typically overseen by some sort of administration at the system level. They tend to not be involved very much in any of the day-to-day decisions and tend to have a larger forward-thinking focus for the organization. So decision drivers at this phase, code requirements, again, always making sure that what we're doing isn't jeopardizing any kind of code that we need to meet throughout the facility. Operational impact probably becomes second most important at this phase. Downtime for maintenance and equipment repairs is extremely impactful at this phase. If you have an operating room that needs filters changed twice as often as something else, that's less surgeries that you can perform, that's less revenue. It's impactful to doctors who will straight up take their patients and go treat them at another facility if they can get the time that they need. It's downed patient rooms. It's pharmacies that can't compound because they are smoke testing the filters that day. All sorts of things that play into minimizing operational downtime. A couple things that help support that, and the kind of groups that these facility managers like to work with, are people that are available. If you have an issue, you need something that's replaced, the kind of group that they like to work with is someone that can be there on the spot with what they need, that afternoon. They can't wait around a week for somebody, a technician to fly in and do this and that and have to get with this person. It kind of all needs to happen right now. And it's a little bit of a shift in thinking from the way that we select partners earlier on when we talk about our kind of larger, mechanical trade partners and things like that, where we need someone that's extremely sophisticated to work through these large budgets, work through a lot of these issues with us. And that kind of changes when we get to, I need it now, once these facilities are kind of open and activated. And then kind of fourth on this list is lifecycle cost analysis. First cost is important, but not quite as important in the eyes of the facility manager who handles these yearly budgets and kind of sees the monthly bills that come in for the decisions that are made. So their focus tends to shift away from how much is it going to cost me right now to what is the lifetime cost of everything that I'm going to see. And that's honestly not just dollars, but kind of effort that's involved from the facility manager and their team. So kind of 5 phases to a project, as I mentioned. Project launch tends to be behind closed doors, as I mentioned, not a lot of influence being able to be made at that phase of a project. During the design phase, I'll remind that we have these PIT teams that really are responsible for 99% of the decision-making on a project, and that carries through all the way until the end. So those decisions that get made there stick with us. Contracting, again, this budget alignment process, extremely, extremely critical throughout the process, happens on every major project. So being able to come to the table with ideas about how we can think innovatively, think differently, and reduce cost on this project is extremely well received by everybody on these project teams. We get into the construction phase, where I mentioned at that point, there's extremely limited opportunity to make changes, to influence. We have a plan that's set in motion, and it takes a lot to deviate from that plan. And then activation and operations phase, which tends to be very reactionary to all the decisions that were made throughout the construction of the facility to things that happen on the day-to-day. So the big focus there is how do we respond to things quickly and kind of minimize. So thank you, everybody, for your time. If there are any questions, I am happy to field them.
In that life cycle you have, where does the filter sales replacement, do you enter in the design, in the project? Most people probably go to the end where it's operational, but is there a point you can enter early and scope yourself in?
Yeah, so you are correct. At the end there is where you see all those replacements happen. But I think kind of going back to those facility standards books are the way to kind of get yourself involved early on. if you can be speaking with a facility manager who has, X, Y, and Z gripe about their filtration, and tell them, well, if you were to write this into a standards book, here's a spec, here's language that I can give you. All you need to do is pass it along to your design partners when you go and build the next facility, when you go and renovate this area. That's probably, I would think, the most successful way to kind of get yourself involved in the start, leveraging the kinds of contacts that you probably already have. Happy to take any other questions. You guys get some bonus story time. So I just finished a particularly cumbersome pharmacy activation down in Atlanta. And filters, probably spent the most time in my career talking about filters there than I ever have anywhere else. So the scope of the project was basically we're constructing these two large compounding rooms within these pharmacies. They're beholden to USP 797 and 800. And they are just filled to the brim with fan filter units with, low air returns. And we had a particularly sophisticated pharmacy group that was, really out there kind of writing papers about the best way to design these facilities. So we really got into the details of kind of how these things are designed and how they worked. A couple challenges that we faced throughout that had to do, I think I mentioned before, smoke testing these filters. So there's a lot that goes into maintenance on the fan filter units within these pharmacies, specifically having to do these smoke tests. They're extremely impactful to operations. Pharmacy turnaround times tend to be 30 minutes, maybe 40 minutes for, kind of we receive an order, the drug is compounded and, at the patient's bedside or operating room. So any kind of downtime to send somebody in there and do that really it detracts a lot from their ability to get their work done. So what we ended up doing was we used kind of remote exhaust ports for these filters. And there were probably 24 of them within these two rooms that kind of stretched out into the kind of central area of the pharmacy that we could really just stand on a ladder and kind of do our tests. We didn't have to go into the clean rooms. The staff could keep working. Really was a major operational improvement from what they were seeing in their existing facilities. Kind of another area we got caught there was during the kind of commissioning and testing phase of that startup. So we bring in a kind of specialty certifier that reports into the State Board of Pharmacy to kind of test all of these filtration units, test all of our airflows, and make sure that our pressures are correct, all that kind of good stuff is in place, and that we're in adherence to USP 797 and 800. We did great on our first time around, except for this one fan filter unit. We just could not keep cracking. We were there Friday night at 9 p.m. trying to replace filters and do this or that or whatever. And kind of what we ended up finding was on these fan filter units, the kind of filter slots into place and this knife edge kind of cuts into the gel and the gel that's around there. And we couldn't get a good seal, could not get a good seal on any of them. After some investigation, what we found was the supplier that we were receiving the filters from was pulling off the back of the warehouse. And these things had been sitting there for 6, 9, 12 months. And that gel had kind of dried and cracked and kind of kept giving us these faulty readings, not faulty, but bad readings. So we ended up having to send our guy down to the warehouse to make sure that we were picking the appropriate filter for the space. One that was newer, that would kind of, that knife edge would cut into that gel. So anyway, the lesson learned there is try to have an understanding of where the filters that you're placing are going and kind of what kind of eyes are going to be on testing of those filters. The testing that we do in a pharmacy is way, way more extreme than anything that we would do even in an operating room, So making sure that the right product goes to the right place could have avoided our supplier from quite literally chucking a dozen of these things into the trash because we refused to accept them. If anything comes to mind, I'll be hanging around. Thank you guys so much for your time.
Thanks for listening to the Talking Air Filtration podcast, a production of the National Air Filtration Association. Clean air matters.